Hello and welcome to Berlin Re-Guided with me, Ryan Balmer. Last time we took a look at how the Weimar period of Berlin's history attracted and affected people like the writer Christopher Isherwood, and we took a brief look at the continued resonance of that era on the life and work of David Bowie. This time we'll be mainly focusing on Bowie and what happens to him in the almost immediate aftermath of that brief meeting with Christopher Isherwood in Los Angeles in 1976. Key players and motifs from last time will often return this time as we explore how, against all the odds and all good sense, Bowie's move to the weirdest and most volatile city in Europe turned out for the best. If you enjoy the video, get liking, get subscribing, sound off in the comments. By the time of Bowie and Isherwood's meeting in 1976, the enormous success of a Hollywood production of Cabaret had pushed an image of Weimar Berlin and Isherwood's name further into the mainstream than it had previously been. Now, as it turns out, there was an odd synchronicity between the activities of the two men at the time of this meeting. Both Isherwood and Bowie were attempting to look back to the Weimar period for inspiration of some sort, and both were really struggling to achieve that. Because of Bowie's fragile state, of course, he would struggle to remember accurately what he had said or done last week, never mind be able to form an objective opinion of something that happened 40 years ago. As it turns out though, Isherwood's situation was far more poignant. He wrote that the success of adaptations of his work on stage and screen caused him to confuse characters with their real-life inspirations, and how he wished that he still had his Berlin diaries to help him remember. Isherwood was terrified of his diaries falling into the wrong hands, which, given the legal view of homosexuality in most countries at the time, was entirely understandable. Unfortunately, it means that Isherwood's best primary source for remembering his time in the city ended up going up in flames. What I find particularly affecting about this is when we remember that Isherwood was actually at the book burning back in 1933, the first Nazi-organised book burning after they took power. He saw thousands of books destroyed, books written by communists, pacifists, socialists, Jews, and of course, homosexuals. Within a few years then of witnessing the first Nazi book burning, Isherwood felt compelled to destroy his own writings. He was forced to rely on whatever fragments he had left. Just a short time after meeting Isherwood, Bowie would come to West Berlin for only the second time, and it's during that visit that he first encounters Romy Haag. She was a transgender cabaret performer and singer who owned a nightclub that used to occupy the building just behind me. Romy Haag's nightclub offered an approximation of the type of Weimar decadence that Bowie was no doubt seeking when he came to West Berlin in 1976. There are dramatically differing accounts of how serious the relationship between Haag and Bowie would become. At one end of the scale, there are some who believe it was simply a short and inconsequential fling, but at the other end, there are those who suggest that in fact Bowie moved to West Berlin shortly afterwards to continue that relationship with Haag. Most likely, however, the truth lies somewhere between these two opinions, with Romy Haag offering just another motivation for Bowie to move to West Berlin just a few months after they first met. What we shouldn't glean from this story, however, is a sense that West Berlin was some kind of utopia when it came to sexuality and gender. In part one, we saw how during Isherwood's time in Berlin, Dr. Magnushirschfeld was fighting to have paragraph 175 overturned. Well, almost half a century later, when this, one of the first Berlin Pride marches, was taking place, a watered-down version of that law was still being used to prosecute men because of their sexuality. West Berlin had indeed become a magnet for free thinkers, outsiders, and marginalised groups once again, but like the rest of West Germany, it still had some way to go. Nevertheless, there was a sense that history was repeating itself, that the city was once again earning a reputation as a relatively open-minded place. For someone who for over a decade now had been confronting, confounding, awakening and agitating people with his own ambiguous gender and sexuality, Berlin seemed a fairly obvious destination. I'm standing in one of the most depressing car parks in Germany. Just a couple of 100 metres behind me used to stand the new Reich Chancellery, designed by Albert Speer for his boss Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. Alongside it was an underground complex of bunkers that included the so-called Führer bunker. During one of his first visits to Berlin, David Bowie went through Checkpoint Charlie and into East Berlin and visited this location. There's not much to see today, and there was even less to see back then. There's no museum, there's certainly no monument. Bowie's visit was by no means strange. Most tourists, when they come to Berlin these days, certainly make the same journey. But there are some who would have us believe that a visit such as this was part of a pattern of more concerning behaviour, which suggests that Bowie's fascination with the Third Reich and some of its key figures went beyond a mere superficial obsession. In 1976, Bowie returned to London after more than 2 years in Los Angeles. He was snapped at Victoria Station, waving to photographers and journalists who had assembled to greet him on arrival. One of the photographs certainly appeared to show that he was flicking something of a Nazi salute at those standing below his car. Unfortunately, this hopefully badly timed photograph came on the back of a number of ill-advised interviews that Bowie had given, presumably when he was somewhat worse for wear. In these interviews, he often extolled the virtues of fascist dictatorships. He also expressed, if not an admiration, certainly a fascination with certain key figures of the Third Reich. He claimed to be working on a movie about the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. In a much more sober interview in 1983, Bowie would be pretty candid about his frame of mind at that point. At the time, it seemed transparently obvious what the answer to life was, he would say. My whole life would be transformed into this bizarre, nihilistic fantasy world of impending doom, mythological characters, and imminent totalitarianism. Oddly, it seemed like moving to West Berlin and being closer to the former nerve centre of National Socialism had a somewhat sobering effect on Bowie's burgeoning obsessions. It at least gave him cause for some self-reflection. His description of how he arrived with, as he puts it, visions of swastikas in my head and plans for everyone will pop up in his song China Girl in 1983. But it was actually written with and recorded by Iggy Pop on his solo album The Idiot way back in 1977, not long after their arrival in the city. But as well as simply putting this scandal down to his fragile state of mind at the time, I think we could also look at his lyrical output over the years, numerous interviews where he broaches this subject, and also his personal life to suggest that if he was some kind of wannabe brown-shirted fascist, then he wasn't exactly very committed to that project. Beyond that, of course, Bowie would not be the first or the last artist to have this kind of ill-advised flirtation with the imagery at the heart of National Socialism. Ron Asheton, Iggy Pop's former bandmate in the Stooges, objectively the best band of all time, had a large collection of Nazi memorabilia, and he wasn't exactly shy when it came to posing with it for photographers. And of course, around about the same time that Bowie and Iggy were in West Berlin, punk icons such as Sid Vicious and Susie Sue were wearing the swastika as a provocation to the older generations. Even Christopher Isherwood would confess to something of a dark fascination with certain Nazi figures. In the 1970s, he wrote that he was disappointed in himself that he did not use the opportunity to pose as a freelance journalist in order to gain an interview with Joseph Goebbels and even Adolf Hitler himself. He wrote that it would surely have been one of the most memorable experiences of his time in Berlin. Bowie may have had a fierce interest in the Weimar era of Berlin's history, but the Berlin of 1976 was a vastly different city in almost every way imaginable. West Berlin's situation made it a somewhat unattractive place to live in the minds of most West German people. But from that point onwards, it only got worse, at least for the next few years. In 1961, in August of that year, the East Germans decided to stop their own citizens using West Berlin as a stepping stone to West Germany, as an escape from the country, by sealing it off. This meant, of course, building a wall around West Berlin, 155 kilometres long. JFK turns up a couple of years later and tries his best to reassure the people of West Berlin that they won't be sold out or abandoned.
I know of no town, no city that has been besieged for 18 years that still lives with the vitality and the force and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin.
But ultimately, the city begins to gain a reputation as a pretty dark and depressing place. A sense of alienation, isolation, and paranoia filled the air. Since the late 1960s, West Germany as a whole had been undergoing something of a reckoning with its past, as a younger generation of angry students began to demand a more complete denazification of the country, as well as more honesty when it came to the crimes of the Nazi period. They were horrified that some Nazi criminals had either been freed from prison early or had evaded justice entirely and were sometimes even back in positions of great responsibility. The most violent of the groups to emerge from this initially peaceful student movement was the Baader Meinhof, or Red Army faction, and it would implode in a convulsion of kidnappings, assassinations, plane hijackings and mass suicides in 1977, just months after Iggy and Bowie moved to West Berlin. So West Berlin by the 1970s was something of a powder keg, but still a steady stream of young idealists, nihilists and fantasists continued to pour into the city over the years. They were attracted by the comparatively low subsidised cost of living. They were attracted by the exemption from military service for young West German males who moved here, and the perception, a widely held perception, that West Berlin was a far less conservative place than many other West German cities. The way that Bowie's move to West Berlin is often portrayed is that it was merely an escape from the myriad personal and psychological issues that he was suffering from by the mid-1970s. But I would argue that the move to this absolute basket case of a city in 1976 was as much of a confrontation with some of those issues as anything else. After all, if you were trying to run away from drugs, the Nazis and the occult, why on earth would you move to Berlin? With all this in mind, plus the acrimonious final collapse of his first marriage to contend with, it comes as a surprise to literally everyone that the move to West Berlin would produce one of the most fruitful artistic periods of Bowie's life. Now, it wasn't as if him and Iggy moved here and began to live like monks. Years later, when Iggy was asked about how much they had cleaned up when they came to West Berlin, he merely replied that it was cleaner than before. In the end, Bowie would write and record the first two Iggy Pop albums, The Idiot and Lust for Life, as well as what he would later call his Berlin trilogy, Low, Heroes and Lodger, within an incredibly short time. The first two albums of that trilogy, in particular Low and Heroes, are now widely seen as two of the most significant of his career. I say now because initially Low was quite sniffily received in many quarters, with lots of critics regarding it as something of a disappointment. Now, obviously, everyone is welcome to their own opinion, but if you know someone who still holds that opinion of that album, I would suggest cutting them out of your life immediately. Bowie would later reveal that the move to Berlin wasn't initially the clean break that the two were looking for. The song Always Crashing in the Same Car that features on Low was about him ramming a drug dealer's car on West Berlin's glitzy Kudamm after being ripped off. Fortunately though, beyond this kind of narcotic tomfoolery, there was an abundance of inspiration to rely on just down the road from Bowie's apartment. Bowie would reside in this apartment building on Schöneberg's Hauptstrasse during his time in Berlin. When he cycled to the Hansa recording studios near Potsdamer Platz, he couldn't avoid feeling the weight of history. Just down the street was a grand old courthouse that was used by the Nazis to condemn some of those involved in an assassination plot against Hitler in 1944. Alongside that was Kathreiner House, built in the modernist New Objectivity style by Bruno Paul in 1930, which in turn sat next to the long demolished Sportspalast, where Joseph Goebbels gave his Total War speech in 1943. And just about the time that Bowie arrived, a colossal, brutalist social housing project was being completed, straddling the rather obstinate Nazi-era concrete bunker that remained. Layer upon layer of history was everywhere he looked. Low was finished at the Hansa recording studios behind me. The bulk of Heroes and Lust for Life were also recorded there. Bowie and Iggy could not have picked a more atmospheric location. You've probably noticed that around here there are hardly any buildings that look about the same age as Hansa. You could probably guess why. Just about 200 metres up the road from Hansa Studios stands Potsdamer Platz. By the 1930s, this was the absolute beating heart of Berlin. It was a neon-soaked assault on the senses, and it was almost completely destroyed by the end of World War II. The rebirth of Potsdamer Platz post-war proved to be somewhat tricky, because the dividing line between east and west ended up running right through the centre of it. And of course, from 1961, so did the Berlin Wall. Bowie would later explain that they could sometimes even catch a glimpse of the East German border guards in their watchtowers near the recording studios, and on occasion even hear the shots being fired at potential escapees to the west. This, of course, helped inspire the title track for the Heroes album, a song that came to mean such a great deal for people on either side of the Berlin Wall. In 1987, when Bowie played Westberlin, he played right in front of the Reichstag building, and therefore very close to the western side of the Berlin Wall. In the end, tens of thousands of East German people turned up to their side of the wall and listened to the concert, and this became particularly evident when they were singing along during the performance of Heroes. Whatever Bowie's intentions for that song may once have been, it became abundantly clear that it was now out of his hands, that that song had been adopted by the people of East and West Berlin as theirs. Does it really matter that the central image of that song, the star-crossed lovers embracing at the wall as the shots ring out over their heads, is actually based upon Bowie's very much married at the time producer Tony Visconti having a very much extramarital smooch with one of the backing singers at the wall? Not really, because by the time that story comes out, Heroes had very much taken on a life of its own. For all of the impact that the Cold War era of West Berlin had on Bowie's Berlin output, I would suggest that it was the city's past that still had the greatest effect, especially on his early Berlin work and not just his music. In 1978, he jumps at the chance to appear in Just a Gigolo with the great icon of Weimar Berlin, Marlene Dietrich. Bowie would make many fantastic films over his career. Unfortunately, this was certainly not one of them. Beyond that, the cover photographs for Iggy's first solo album, as well as for Heroes, are nods to art of the pre-war Weimar era. Bowie was delighted upon moving to the city to find that there was an abundance of reasonably affordable woodcuts and prints made by some of these German expressionists that he so admired. He was particularly fond of Erich Heckel, and you could see that admiration manifesting itself on the covers of both of these albums. At the end of 1977, during an interview with the NME, the producer Brianeno would suggest that there was a comparison between how Heckel and many of the other German expressionists used to paint in the Weimar era and the way that they produced these first two Berlin albums. Very rough, tough strokes, and they all have a mood of melancholy about them or nostalgia, as if they were painting something that was just disappearing. Then there was another figure from both Bowie and Berlin's past that kept on popping up in his imagination and his work, the black magician Aleistercrowley. Crowley's legacy seemed to be everywhere you looked in the 60s and 70s. His image appears on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper's album. Led Zeppelin squeeze one of his supreme moral laws, "Do what thou wilt," on the cover of their third album. And Bowie himself had already referenced Crowley on at least two songs on the Hunky Dory album back in 1971, a much more superficially cuddly effort than the Berlin-related output. Now Bowie was about to follow in Crowley's footsteps, moving to the city which had long been a magnet for those interested in dabbling with the dark arts. Even more recently, as Hugo Wilken explains in his book On Low, Crowley was referenced quite explicitly in the title track from Station to Station. When Bowie introduces his new persona, the Weimar villain, the Thin White Duke, he announces himself as throwing darts in lovers' eyes, one of the probably untrue atrocities attributed to the English black magician. Bowie's interest in the occult came to something of a head in Los Angeles just before his move to West Berlin. He had begun to keep jars of his own urine in his fridge in preparation for protective spells against demons. At one point, he even enlists the services of a white witch named Wally Elmlake, who carries out an exorcism at his early residence because Bowie had begun to believe that his swimming pool was possessed. The demons definitely seemed to follow him to Berlin regardless, and still pop up in the lyrics of those first two albums. Hugo Wilkins suggests that the second track on Low, Breaking Glass, quite explicitly refers to the drawing of occult symbols once again. And although Heroes was written even later, Bowie would years afterwards explain that though his mental state was rapidly improving, there was still something lurking in the recesses of his imagination. Those lyrics come from a nook in the unconscious, he would say. Still a lot of house cleaning going on, I feel. I decided to call this project The Ghosts of Weimar Berlin for a number of reasons. Number one, I just thought it sounded like quite a cool title. Number two, more importantly, I was really interested in the way that part of Berlin's history continued to have such a deep resonance on the works, on the imaginations of David Bowie and Christopher Isherwood, but also on the city itself. The way it feels, the way it looks today is still very much, of course, informed by the events of the interwar period and, of course, the rapid destruction of the Weimar Republic after 1933. But I also used that title because of something which I think could be identified in much of David Bowie's Berlin output, and that's its hauntological aspects. Hauntology is a particularly muddy and complex subject. Fortunately, Mark Fisher in Ghosts of My Life does a great job of distilling it down to its bare bones. At the heart of hauntology is the idea that the post-war generation of which Bowie was part never really came to terms with the destruction of modernity because of the Nazi dictatorship and the Second World War. What Fisher suggests is that hauntology can affect art from two very different directions. There is the no longer and the not yet. The no longer is when something has ceased to exist, like an era, like an idea, an epoch, an ideology, but it still continues to be effective in a virtual manner. The not yet is when something has not yet occurred, but is already being effective in a virtual manner. So, an example of the latter on Bowie's work would be the song Heroes, once again. We have a protagonist who is looking forward to some kind of better future, which of course doesn't yet exist. And that's what gives the song its optimism, because they are looking forward to a time when the wall would fall and they and their partner would be reconciled in some way, shape or form. But what gives it its overriding sense of melancholia in terms of its lyrics and also just the tone of the music, I would say, is how unlikely that is to happen anytime soon. And that's something that it shares with most hauntology, this overarching sense of melancholy. Because from the perspective of the late 1970s, the idea that the Berlin Wall would fall anytime soon and the two Germanys or the two Berlins or these two protagonists would be brought back together or unified in some way did seem such a distant prospect. But a great deal more of Bowie's Berlin output is affected by hauntology from the other direction, the no longer. Especially those instrumental tracks that we find on Low and to a lesser extent Heroes. On those songs, it's as if Bowie is projecting into an imagined future from the past. So into the late 1970s from the perspective of the Weimar era, in this case the late 1920s. And by doing so, he's posing some pretty enormous questions. What if the Weimar Republic did not collapse? What if modernity had not been shattered? And the answer he seems to be posing is on those albums. What he was saying, I believe, is that we would be making music that sounded like this. As Fisher elaborates, throughout the 20th century, music culture was a probe that played a major role in preparing the population to enjoy a future that was no longer white, male or heterosexual, a future in which the relinquishing of identities that were in any case poor fictions would be a blessed relief. Bowie then acted as something of a synthesis of the no longer and the not yet, a fusing of the revolutionary spirit of Weimar Berlin and that post-war music culture that Mark Fisher identifies. Describing the creative process involved in making those albums during an interview in 2001, Bowie explained that Tony, Brian and I created a powerful, anguished, sometimes euphoric language of sounds. In some ways, sadly, they captured, unlike anything else in that time, a sense of yearning for a future that we all knew would never come to pass.